Hello and welcome to The Arise interview, 60 glorious minutes of multifaceted discussion where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and we feature the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Just before we go into the program, some breaking news. Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari has reappointed Abba Kyari as his Chief of Staff and Boss Mustafa as Secretary to the Government of the Federation. The appointments are being seen as a sign of continuity in government, and we'll bring you more details later in the program. Coming up in the next hour, she's a British-Nigerian author that's known around the world as the Queen of African Horror, a novelist with the ability to weave fantastical tales of the macabre that strike fear into the hearts of her legion of readers in Europe, the United States and Japan. But astonishingly, most people in Africa, where she originates from, have never heard of Nuzo Onoh, a UK-based author who's become one of the world's best horror writers and certainly one of Africa's major contemporary global literary exports. The Queen of African Horror, Nuzo Onoh, in a moment. Now, since releasing her first book in 2014, the short story collection known as The Reluctant Dead, the British-Nigerian writer Nuzo Onoh has gained an international reputation for launching a new subgenre of horror writing known as African horror. Her ability to weave West African folklore and culture with global elements of dark fantasy, classic ghost tales and real-life evil has provided even the most hardened horror fan with something new and out of the ordinary and terrifying. Everything from witchcraft, demonic possession and the undead, to child sacrifice, sexual abuse and the horrors of war, all blended together in a rich, frightening narrative that's brought a new level of authenticity and vividness to the horror writing genre. But as you enjoy the thrill and sheer brilliance of her craft, especially in books like The Sleepless, On Hallowed Graves and Dead Corpse, a note of caution. Nuzo Onoh's books are not for the faint-hearted, and they will haunt you long after you've turned the last page. Well, in a moment, we'll be joined from our London studio by the author herself. But first, here are some of the world's top horror writers and book reviewers celebrating the works of Nuzo Onoh in this podcast. Take a listen.
I stumbled across Nuzo in a very happy accident because I think I've written about this a couple of times. I like finding new and just authors I haven't found before, and I usually use the Kindle Unlimited program to do that. And I found her book, which was the first one that I found. I think it was Unhallowed Graves, wasn't it, Nuzo?
Yeah, it was.
And
Yes.
that collection of stories blew me away. And I reviewed that for Lovecraft's Easing. And after that, I believe we did the interview next. And then you released the Sleepless, which even more kind of up the ante because that was your novel. Was that your first novel?
That was the first African horror novel, yes.
That was the first African horror novel. And then you followed that up with your latest novel, Dead Corpse, which it's weird because when somebody's already operating at a strong level, you know, I kind of, when you sent me Dead Corpse, I kind of had that trepidation going on because you're like, oh crap, what, you get that what if type of thing. And then it was good. You read my review of it, but you keep on going from strength to strength to strength on it. But even from that very first review that I did of Unhallowed Graves.
Yeah, ASAP, I just got to jump in and say that first story, especially, and it grabs you right off the bat. That is just gut-wrenching.
Because I still remember that. And like I said in the review, even if you took all of the supernatural elements out of that, that story would hit you hard.
Oh yeah.
You know, what was it? The
Yeah.
Unclean?
Yeah.
The Unclean. Yes.
Yeah. That story would hit you hard. And I think you're one of the very few writers that I have talked to within this genre where your life story and you yourself are just as fascinating as your writing.
Thank you.
You know what I mean?
Thank you.
And that's some of the world's top horror writing reviewers celebrating the works of Nuzo Onoh in that podcast. And I'm absolutely thrilled to bits, but also scared witless to say that the queen of African horror herself, Nuzo Onoh, joins me from our London studios. Absolutely delighted to see you, Nuzo. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. I know you live in Coventry and you took the train over, and we do appreciate that.
Thank you, Charles.
Welcome to the Arise interview, and let's go straight into it. I mean, I think people are curious, first of all. I mean, this is going to be a biographical interview, so it's going to last a while. But let's just get into what has made you an international writing star. How did you start writing? Because you were already, if I understand correctly, a lawyer and had a couple of other degrees, but then you decided to go back to university and get a master's degree in creative writing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As you said, writing and I had a love relationship from a very young age. I think I was in secondary school then at Queen's School in Enugu. My first year, when I decided I wanted to be a writer, and I got some of my friends and we formed a club called the COYW, the Club of Young Writers, and decided we were going to go around visiting my father's friends and everyone we knew to ask them to support the club. I don't think we ever wrote anything apart from using the money we got to buy ourselves biscuits and drinks and everything to supplement the school dinners. But that was when the love for writing grew. But at the same time, I also fell in love with music. I've always been into music. I play the piano and I play the guitar. And while I was at school, everyone knew me as the musician, you know, and I always thought I was going to go down the music route. In fact, sometime in the early 80s, after my A-levels, I did run away from home and I went down to Onitsha in the heydays of Tabansi Records and Rogers All-Star Studios. And for a year, it was brilliant. I was there in Onitsha, enjoying myself, doing background singing, going on tours. It was brilliant until, unfortunately, I lost my sister in the plane crash in 1983. And that's when my dad decided I had to come home and study law, since I became what we Igbos know as the Ada, the first daughter, following my sister. And yeah, I went on to do law. I didn't really enjoy it. I didn't want to do law. And after that, I got married, my first marriage. I had my daughter. You know that very well, since my marriage was to someone from your family. But it broke down, and then I began working for my father, managing his, what do you call it, the factory where he makes beer and soft drinks. But it's hard when you work with family. And eventually
Right, I'm just going to come in there, Nuzo. I don't mean to interrupt you.
After that, I decided.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'm just going to come in there for a minute, because the line went off for just a bit. These are sort of rather tremulous technological lines, and we lost you there for a minute, but you're back now. And let me just move the conversation on a bit and ask you how much you were talking quite a bit about your life there, and I know that there've been different, obviously, periods of your life that were very significant. How much of your life story is linked to some of the stories that you tell and the books that you write? Because, as someone said, your life story is as fascinating, or almost as fascinating, or perhaps more fascinating than the books you write.
Yeah, I think it depends on the book. There are some books that are pure fiction. It's got nothing to do with my life story, but there are others, especially the Sleepless, that had a lot to do with my life story, because that book, I called it my exorcism book. I had to exorcise the demons of the Biafran civil war that had been with me all my life. So the Sleepless was very, very influenced by my life in many, many ways. But apart from the Sleepless, the others were like stories I heard from my mother, who was, as I always called her, the consummate storyteller. My mom was an amazing storyteller. She told me so many stories. And so I would always remember some of the stories she told me and use them in the books. But otherwise, I mean, most authors, most writers tend to have bits of themselves in anything they write. So there will always be some element of me in my work, but the Sleepless is the only one I can say that reflected me a lot, because also I had a personal experience with water exorcism, which was also in that book. And so, yeah.
So, I mean, that sounds absolutely fascinating, Nuzo. And I mean, it's just brilliant watching you, having read a lot of your books and come across a lot of people in the UK and America who have read your books, who are just absolutely fascinated by them. And just to hear you talking about how the characters and how some of the ideas come to you is equally interesting. And there is now a particular genre or a subgenre that you brought into existence, if you like, known as African horror. I mean, is that different from general Western horror? And if so, what is the difference?
African horror, like I always have had so many lectures and many speeches where I've been asked that question, and I'm hoping that very soon that question won't be relevant anymore, because it would have become something normal. People will accept it as a bona fide genre of horror. Because prior to me promoting African horror, if you had a search on the internet on the word African horror, what you would get would be all these negative connotations about the continent, the African continent. If you put in American horror or British horror or Chinese horror or Japanese horror, you would get stories, results about horror works. But once you put in African horror, you would either get results about AIDS or about war or famine, just all the negative things about the continent. And that's when I decided I was going to take over that term and turn it into something positive, what it should be, which is another subgenre, a regional horror genre, just like you have with all these other ones I mentioned.
Right, okay. I'm going to ask you just for a minute there, Nuzo, to hold your thoughts, because unfortunately we have to take a break. You're watching the Arise interview, plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the celebrated Queen of Horror and Dark Fantasy, Africa, Nuzo Onoh. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniegolu, and we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world, and we feature the voices at the heart of the stories in this program. And just before we continue, just to remind you of that breaking news story that we had at the top, Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari has reappointed Abba Kyari as his Chief of Staff and Boss Mustafa as Secretary to the Government of the Federation. The appointments are being seen as a sign of continuity in government, and we will bring you more on that as the day progresses. Now, for anyone who wants to find a new horror fiction writer to read, the books of the internationally recognized Queen of African Horror, Nuzo Onoh, come highly recommended. One of those famous super scary authors that horror buffs and indeed everyone should read at least once. Her tales of supernatural fiction and contemporary West African-based horror, which are at once brutal, affecting, gory, and absolutely terrifying, have made her one of the most significant 21st century African authors in her genre. Her books are set against a forbiddingly dark and superstitious Nigerian backdrop. Books like The Reluctant Dead, Unhallowed Graves, The Sleepless, and Dead Corpse. Scary novels that make the hair on the back of your neck stand up just from the rustle of turning the pages. Books you don't want to read at night, but at the same time you simply can't put down. Here are some of the most notable American reviewers of horror books analyzing the works of Nuzo Onoh.
I'm almost 50. I've been reading since, I was 4 years old, and I've not read anything yet like Nuzo's horror. It's not Western horror. It really hit me like a ton of bricks. That Unclean Story, that was the first one I read, and I haven't read as much as yourself yet, as ASAP has, but that was the first story that I read, and you just feel so badly for the protagonist and for some of the other characters and for what they're going through, and it's not just that, it is supernatural horror, and the ghosts in this type of horror are not like the Western ghosts. So
No.
very disturbing story, but I think very important to read. Disturbing in the right ways, if that makes sense.
And the Queen of African Horror, Nuzo Onoh, is still with me from our London studios. Apologies, Nuzo, for the way we sort of interrupted you the last time, but we've got these pre-programmed commercials that must play at a certain time. But let's move on and make the most of the time that we've got with you. We're very privileged to have you here. Is there amongst some of your readers, because before we went on break, you were talking about how you were trying to change the narrative on Africa, and when you Google sort of African horror, the sort of things that would come up. But is there among some of your readers a sense that you are in some ways further deepening the stereotypes about Africa and the black world in your writing? That, for instance, the general impression that the continent is steeped in voodoo and black magic and superstition are reinforced in the stories you tell in your books about Africa?
Yes, I have had people ask me that same question, and they say things like, one mustn't wash their dirty laundry in public. And I always say, well, if you don't want the shame of people seeing your dirty laundry in public, then don't make it really filthy. We can't lie about our continent. There are things going on in our continent that are terrible, that are bringing a lot of harm and pain to the majority of the citizens. Up till today, we still have child witches being lynched. We still have people who are killing, ritual murders, especially during elections. We still have terrible, terrible traditional practices around widowhood. We still have the Osu caste system. In fact, there are so many negative things still going on, and all mired in superstition. It is a continent that is being ruled and controlled by superstition. And my opinion is that if I write about these things and it shames us, then maybe the powers that be might take some actions to do something to improve the continent. Also, I always say to myself that horror, like every other genre, is pure entertainment. And regardless of anybody's circumstances, the circumstances in Africa, nothing stops them from being entertained with horror, their own horror narrative. Prior to recent times, the horror narrative had been driven by whites, mainly white males, and when you see Africans or black people in those stories, those characters were always portrayed as either demonic, evil, vile, subhuman. And so now this is our time to take over the narrative and present our own protagonists the way we want them to be. In my stories, I don't just write about the bad things happening in the African continent, especially the Igbo people. I write about both the good things, the culture, the good things about our culture, the things we value, and hopefully I try to entertain people and let others who don't know about Africa discover more about our culture. I remember recently I gave a talk at the Miskatonic Institute of Horror Studies in London. And when I went for that talk, I remember saying to them, they asked me a question, and somebody said to me, in your African tribes, and I had to correct them and say, no, please don't use the expression tribes with all the negative connotations of primitive savagery that is used when describing African communities. You don't see anybody describing British villages as tribes. That was used during the colonial era. So, you know, that I was happy. I said to them, I used to make the same mistake as well, as describing us as tribes, but not anymore. You know, so by the end of that lecture, I was happy when questions were asked and people were now saying African communities. So hopefully, with me writing these stories, people are getting to discover African culture. They are getting to discover the people, but as well, we Africans who read it, hopefully, will see the errors we'll make and hopefully try to free ourselves from the bondage of superstitions, because I think that is what is destroying the continent.
Well, I'm glad you actually mentioned that issue about tribe, because I do try to communicate that to people here in Nigeria, that it evokes the images of sort of autochthonous, you know, tribal people running around in grass skirts and so on, but the people persist in using the term tribe. So I'm glad like you're furthering that idea when you talk to people. But of course, your particular type of horror writing, Nuzo, is not the slice and dice kind where there is a mass murderer sort of on the loose, but tends to be more supernatural and metaphysical, doesn't it? With sort of monsters and demons and angels and sort of fairly hellish characters.
Yeah, I mean, African horror is a mixture of magical realism and fantasy and horror. You can't, I write ghost stories. My stories are predominantly ghost stories because I like everything to do with ghosts. And because I always say, when I give a lecture about African horror and the elements of African horror, I did mention that in every African horror work, one thing you will find is, one, there will be a reference to a witch doctor or a dibia and juju. There will be reference to born to die children, or banjes or abikus, as the Yorubas call them. There might be references to witches. Witches are very important as well. And so when you put all these together, these are all supernatural stuff, which, if you're writing African horror, they all tend to crop up. And so you find it really scary and very deep, because I try to go deep into the culture. Initially, African horror started as a folk tale, the folk tales told under the moonlight. And a lot of people are still under the impression that African horror are folk tales, you know. We had Amos Tutuola's classic book, The Palm Wine Drinkard, which was, I call it like the beginning of African horror. We have Dio Fangua's book, The Forest of 1,000 Demons, which was translated by the great Wole Soyinka. And we have Credo Mutua's book, Ndaba My Children. So you see, all these books all started out, they are folk tales with all these stories we hear under the moonlight. But that is no longer what African horror is. We have moved beyond the folk tale, so that when we write our stories has all those elements, the classic elements of horror, with fear, anxiety, dread, premonitions, everything combined together with those folk tales, because the folk tale makes it unique. Also, remembering that in Africa, we are the cradle of civilization. And with over 4,000 communities and counting, each one having their own different law and their own different cultures and monsters and entities. And when you use all that, you can build a story that is gripping, that is terrifying, and sell something completely new and different from what is there, what is out there. And I think that's the attraction of African horror. People are discovering something totally different, different from the conventional horror you see. It's ghost stories, but our ghosts are different. I think I did mention that, for instance, in the Igbo culture, we have 4 different kinds of death, and those deaths determine the kind of ghost that comes out. We have one wike when somebody dies suddenly and they are not sure they are dead and they come out and they hang around. They have one wuchu when somebody dies and the whole clan, the whole family line dies out. That's a sad kind of death. Then we have ajomu, like when people commit suicide or when, they've done evil things.
I'm going to ask you again, sorry, really sorry, Nuzo. I'm going to ask you again to hold that thought, because we've come to that awful time. Well, it's not actually awful, because we quite like those breaks, but we've got to take a break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with one of Africa's major contemporary global literary exports, the Queen of African Horror, Nuzo Onoh. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Now, one of my favorite novels by the British-Nigerian horror writer Nuzo Onoh would have to be The Sleepless, a chilling tale about the restless and vengeful dead. In it, an innocent boy is lured to his death by the one person that should have protected him. But someone knows the truth about his disappearance, his little sister, Obele, a child that hears a secret voice that tells her terrible things no child should know about. Obele knows too much and must be killed. Her salvation lies in the hands of her new friends, a group of giggling little girls she meets at an abandoned, cursed house. Except their friendship comes with a terrible price, and she still has to find a way to free the tormented ghost of her dead brother trapped by a witch doctor's curse. Set against the backdrop of the Nigerian Civil War, The Sleepless follows one child's struggles against both the natural and supernatural forces that threaten to end her life before the crossfire of the deadly weapons of war can do so. Before we speak again to the writer Nuzo Onoh, let's catch a bit more of that podcast featuring a team of American reviewers talking about her work.
I've got 4 books now. I've got The Reluctant Dead. That's a collection of short stories. I've got Unhallowed Graves, and that's 3 novellas. And I've got The Sleepless and Dead Corpse. Those are the novels.
Right.
And fingers crossed, we'll soon have, I've got some anthologies as well, a few anthologies, but fingers crossed we'll have the 5th novel this year.
Great.
And that's A Dance with the Dead. Yes.
Well, Nuzo, thanks for being on the show, and it was really great talking with you. And ASAP, thanks for
Mike.
doing the interview. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah, for all the listeners, you can pick up Nuzo's books at Amazon. I think they're all available on Kindle and in print, right? So whichever you prefer. Nuzo Onoh. So thanks, Nuzo. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you. And thank you, Mike. Thank you, ASAP. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely evening.
Have a good night. I know it's late where you are, so.
Bye.
I followed you on Twitter, so follow me back.
Okay, I will. I
All
will.
right.
Bye, SF Gorgeous.
Cool. Bye, gorgeous. I'll see you guys later. I gotta go make birthday dinner for the
All
one.
right. Thank you, ASAP. Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
guys. Bye.
Bye, Asa.
She doesn't have to follow you back. I don't follow you.
You don't?
Yeah, no, I do.
Well, no, I meant like follow me back so that we can stay in touch because she's in the UK. And
Oh, okay.
I
Yeah.
wasn't saying like follow me back because I need to follow her.
Well, aren't they all just chums? And the Africa's global literary exporter, Nuzo Onoh, is still with me in our studios in London. And Nuzo, thank you very much indeed for staying with us there. And there, as we said, lots of ghosts in your writing. I have to admit that when I read Sleepless, and I think the Unhallowed Graves, I mean, I simply couldn't read it at night because they were just, you know, terrifying, very scary. But these things have their provenance out of your imagination. They emerge from your head. I mean, do you ever get scared that your characters might come alive and torment you? Are you frightened by them?
Tell you the truth, Charles, when I write, I tend to write at night. Because then if I'm writing and I find myself afraid, then I know that I'm finally delivering a good work. If I can't scare myself, then I'm not sure that I can scare other people. But one thing, unfortunately, I've always been a victim of nightmares. From a very young age, I have terrible dreams. And sometimes I use those dreams in my writing. In one of my books, The Reluctant Dead, one of the stories there was based completely on a dream I had, coupled with a story my mom told me. So yes, sometimes my characters can haunt my dreams, but one thing I think is that they want their stories to be told. And a lot of them is like the one in Unhallowed Graves, Our Bones Shall Rise Again. That one was initially inspired by the Igbo landing tragedy. We all know about the Igbo landing in Georgia, USA, when a group of Igbo slaves in 1803 decided to commit mass suicide by walking into the river rather than be taken into slavery. And that place has become a tourist attraction. It's said that the ghosts of these dead Igbos haunt the shores of the sea. And that story worried me, and I just felt I had to give them closure. I had to bring them back home, their ghosts, and bring them back home to African land, to Igbo land. And I began writing Our Bones Shall Rise Again. But then in writing it, Oba, the main character, took over. And the next thing I knew, I was writing something that wasn't even what I had planned to write. And by the time I finished reading that story, I said to myself, did you write that? You know, and that happens to me many times. I would write something, and when I finish reading it, I'm saying to myself, did you actually write that? And then I've come to realize that our characters have a life of their own in a different realm, you know. I've always believed in what do you call it? The other realm, the shadow realm. And so when we write, I say, let the characters speak, let them take us where they want us to go. And that's what I do.
And I think probably, I have to say that one of the, I mean, I've read quite a lot of your books, are absolutely fascinating. I mean, I've got friends from Australia who were actually the people who introduced me to your books, which is quite extraordinary. But I think probably the scariest one was Night Market, where you had this commingling between the living and the dead. I mean, where did you get that sort of inspiration? Where did it come from?
Funnily enough, that was the only story I've ever written that had a white protagonist, set in Lagos and the UK. I got the idea. I had a friend when I was working at the British High Commission in Nigeria. I met a friend who was one of the diplomats there, and I met up with him later, and he was telling me about visiting Calabar. And when he went to Calabar to visit this person, the person was mentioning about a place, a market that nobody goes to at night. And when he was saying it, there was a lot of skepticism. He was very found that this very educated and rich man believed in the myth of this night market that nobody goes to. So that gave me the idea, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to write a story about the night market. And of course, we all know as well that back home, everyone has heard one story or the other about marketplaces. I remember as a child, we were always told if you go to the marketplace and you drop money or anything, don't stoop to pick it up, because if you stoop, you might see the ghosts walking with their feet not touching the ground. And if you went to the market, make sure if you're given peanuts or anything for free, don't take it, because you might be taking witchcraft and eating witchcraft with the peanuts. So there are so many stories around the marketplace.
But I mean,
so when this chap told me
just,
about this night market in Calabar where people don't go to, I decided I was going to write a story about it, and that's how the story Night Market came about.
Well, I mean, is there also Nuzo
and of course, we all know that expression, quarter to dead, back home. You know, if someone is very ill, they will say to you, oh, quarter to dead.
Right. Is there also an element of real life in your sort of writing? Are there references to the way people live today in Africa, the poverty, the corruption, the religious fanaticism or extremism, the politics, the abuse, that sort of thing?
Yes. I mean, I think in every single book I write, I tend to tackle a specific theme of what's happening back home. So, for instance, in Dead Corpse, what I wanted to do in Dead Corpse was to show the two faces of the witch doctor, because the witch doctor has been so maligned. He's been accused of so many things. In fact, he's behind a lot of evil going on in the continent, because thanks to him and exploiting the ignorance and poverty of the people, a lot of evil and harm take place because of the witch doctors. But then we have the other witch doctor, the good witch doctor, the ones who practice the art as it's meant to be practiced. And that's what I wanted to show in Dead Corpse, that two faces of the witch doctor, that it's a brilliant culture, it's a brilliant profession which shouldn't be ruined and done away with simply because of the evil of those ones we know who manipulate the people for their own nefarious purposes. And then we have the other book, The Sleepless, where I explored the issues of witchcraft and child witches who are being killed and abused. And I also explored the issue of faith abuse with all these Pentecostal churches everywhere. Equally, I find them as dangerous as the crooked witch doctors. I also explored the issues of what do you call it? Ritual murders, that goes on back home as well, and the impact it can have on the life of people. So yes, most of my books I try to bring in one thing or the other happening in the continent, but also I always use things. It's like we Igbos, we have a dying culture called talking in proverbs. So for instance, if an Igbo person wants to warn you and say, don't do that, rather than saying to you, they'll say to you, if the backside gets bitten by the ant, it would learn its lesson. the stubborn chicken lens is lesson in the casserole
Right.
pot of a widow. You know, you don't tell a stubborn person that there is war. So we use all these little idioms to speak.
Well,
and it's a dying art.
Let's hold it there on those absolutely brilliant proverbs because we've got to take a break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including more of our chat with one of Africa's global literary exports, Nuzo Onoh. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniegolu. Now, my guest today is the British-Nigerian writer and pioneer of the African horror subgenre, Nuzo Onoh. She's the author of ghost stories depicting African culture, traditions, beliefs, and superstitions within a horror context. Nuzo was born into the family of Chief Christian Onoh, popularly known as CC, who was a legal practitioner and former governor of the old Anambra state. Her sister Bianca was married to the former Biafran leader Emeka Ojukwu, and her daughter is the British actor, writer and film director Candice Onyama, whose father is Geoffrey Onyama, the immediate past Nigerian foreign minister. Nuzo's works have become hugely popular in the UK, Europe, the US and Japan, where her writings have been described as magical realism and horror that showcase both the beautiful and the horrific in African culture. But while she's celebrated in the West as the queen of African horror, her unique writing is hardly known in her native Nigeria. So why is that? Well, let's continue our chat with the queen of African horror, Nuzo Onoh, who's in our London studios. And thank you very much indeed for your abiding patience and for staying with us. Do you think Africans, Nuzo, will view your writing the same way that it is viewed and celebrated in the West? I mean, you're very well known across places like the United States, UK, and even Japan, but hardly known in your home country, Nigeria, and your continent, Africa.
I mean, what I think, Charles, is because what I write, it's totally different. It's novel. It's not something they are used to in the West. So, of course, they are fascinated by it. Back home, it's normal to us Africans. You know, if an African read my book, what would seem absolutely unbelievable to a Western reader would be normal to an African reader, because that's their daily reality. Ritual murders based on witch doctors and people who are being killed by, prayer warriors who are trying to flog away demons from them. These are all common things we come across every day. People have watched Nollywood films and they have seen our kind of supernatural horror. And so if an African reads my book, yeah, they will be frightened because the ghost elements are quite scary, but they won't be as shocked with a lot of the things in the books as someone who is not African would be, because this is, in many cases, their daily reality. I mean, we read things about albinos who have their body parts cut off and harvested because it's believed that the body part of an albino would help somebody get a powerful juju that would help them progress in life. Now, say that to somebody here and you write something about it, which I wrote in my book, Dead Corpse, and everybody's like shocked. How can that happen? How can people think that a fellow human being, just because of the hue of their skin, suddenly becomes this supernatural being? So a lot of the things in my book, if Africans read it, yes, they will enjoy the entertainment, but they won't be as shocked or stunned as those who are non-Africans.
And that's a very interesting perspective there. I mean, I've heard also you talk about this. is there a difference between African horror and Africans writing horror? Because I know you talked about that in one of your public lectures there.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a difference, because a lot of people, when they see horror work written by someone of African descent, they automatically assume that is African horror. And I say to them, no, that's not African horror. Just because you're an African writing horror doesn't mean that your work is African horror. For it to be African horror, it's got to have all those elements of regional horror that makes it authentic. So, for instance, your characters have to be predominantly Africans, showing African features, mannerisms, names, everything that would identify them as coming from that particular locality. The setting has to be set predominantly in Africa, with landmarks, topography that you can instantly identify as African, just like with other regional horror. You've got to have the culture, the law, the mythos, everything that people can read and know that this is a culture and this is the law of a certain area, Africans. So it's also got to show things like the dialogue, bits of language here and there that can show it as, yes, this is an African
Right.
work. And also it's got to reflect things like the conflicts, certain challenges in a certain area, and the way the locals addressed those challenges. So, for instance, say in China, their local challenge might be the paddy rice field and how to irrigate it. And so when I write my books, for instance, one of my books, Our Bones Shall Rise Again, you would find that it's set in Igbo land. We see things like Ubana, the snake repellent plant. We have the name Oba, so it's a character. His name is Oba, it's an Igbo name. We have a certain landmark, the Omambala River. We have the Igbo word Kachifo. So anyone reading it would see all these things that make it African, together with all the little laws and folk tales and everything, and beliefs of the people.
Right.
Unlike if somebody just writes a novel that is horror,
Right.
and just because they are Africans,
And
that doesn't make it African horror. So, for
Sure.
instance, Helen Oyeyeme's book, The Icarus Girl, a brilliant book. It's not African horror, even though Helen is of African heritage.
Right.
So I always try to make that distinction that not every African that writes horror is writing African
Right,
horror.
I understand that. Now, we're almost getting to the end of the program, so if you could just tell me this briefly. I mean, do you actually keep in touch with Nigeria? Do you travel to this country often?
Charles, I hate flying. Everyone that knows me know that I dread flying. I've been back home three times in the last 7 years, and that was when my mom was ill, and then when my mother died. Otherwise, the family visit me. They know I don't, but I keep in touch with lots of family and friends back home. You know. And tend to find out what's going on. But the actual flying, unfortunately, I will do anything to avoid getting in a plane.
Right. Well, hopefully, if we get more people, if more people hear about you, they'll be demanding or certainly requesting that you come to this country. So what's your next big writing project, Nuzo? What can we expect next from the Queen of African Horror?
Well, right now I'm completing a short story for an anthology of women horror monsters. So mine is going to be the contribution from Africa. So I'm writing about the Mami Water witch. And then I've almost completed the next novel, which is called Dance for the Dead. And that one explores the problem of Osu, the outcast culture we have back home and the impact it can have on people, and all within the horror ghost context. You know, it's a ghost story, as always.
Right, and just before we go, somebody was prodding me here with a question they desperately want to ask you, that you started writing when you were quite no longer a toddler, let's put it that way, certainly fairly advanced past sort of your youngest years, let's say that. Why did you start at that stage? I mean, did you just wake up and say, I'm going to write, or had you been, as you said, you've been dabbling in writing when you were younger, but then you didn't professionally start writing till much later? Very briefly, because we're almost out of time.
Yeah. It was an epiphany. I was at the hairdresser one day and I was saying to myself, what are you doing here? Getting your hair chemically straightened and putting in all these artificial things in your hair and frying your brain cells under the dryer. And I left, I shaved off my hair and decided I was going to grow the dreads. And as I began growing the dreads, I just found a sudden enlightenment, and something just said to me, you know what, you've always wanted to be a writer.
Well, I'm glad you did that,
about
Nuzo. We
I wasn't
appreciate
sure Warwick
the
University
fact
will
that
take
you
me back,
we appreciate the fact that you got into that writing, and we appreciate your being our guest on the Arise interview today. Nuzo Onoh, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again for a fresh edition tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.